Zahvaljujemo gospodinu Keninu, a treće stručno izlaganje održat će gospodin Ari Ben Dror iz instituta Good Food. On će nam se obratiti video linkom.
Good morning. My name is Ari Ben Dror, and I'm the Associate Director at the Good Food Institute, Israel. Today I'm going to discuss one of the most important and yet underfunded solutions to climate change. And I'd like to start us off with a question. This is a graph of global temperature change over time. We know that over the past 150 years or so, temperatures have risen about 1 degree Celsius over the pre-industrial era. Now I want to pose a question about the long-term future. And you can see that the horizontal axis here goes to about year 3000. Now the question I want to pose is the following. Suppose we completely stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow. So we stopped driving all our cars, we shut down all the power plants. Would we have this red curve, a continued increase despite stoppage of emissions? This is related to what you might have heard as committed warming or warming in the pipeline. Or you might imagine option C, that once we stop emitting, the Earth will naturally return over some time to its pre-industrial equilibrium, with temperature change decreasing back to zero. Or would the temperatures stay the same? If I were on stage, I'd ask for a quick show of hands of what you think is the right answer based on the climate messaging you've heard. But since I'm not there, I'll go ahead and assume that most of you thought it was B, and you would be correct. It turns out that what climate science says is that temperatures stay the same after emissions stop. And this is actually a relatively new insight coming from just about 10 to 15 years of climate science. So this is a surprisingly simple behavior of this complex system. And I think there are two important takeaways from this result. One is that any future warming comes from future emissions. So the future is really up to us. And two is that you'll notice this curve is flat for a really long time, meaning that any warming that we've incurred because of what we've already emitted is going to be there for hundreds to thousands of years. So the actions we take now have extremely long consequences, which brings me to another question looking into the future. How will we feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050 and do so sustainably, safely, and securely? According to the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, food systems are responsible for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And animal production is responsible for the bulk of that, with somewhere between 14.5% to 20%. As you can see in this chart, that's more than the world's entire transportation sector combined. So all of our cars, trucks, planes, ships. In fact, according to the IPCC, it will be scientifically impossible to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goal to decarbonize the global economy and keep climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius unless industrial meat production goes down. And that will only happen if global consumers are offered a replacement that meets price and taste expectations. And the problem is actually getting worse by the minute. From this slide, you'll see that the global meat demand just keeps rising. By 2050, the world's population is anticipated to increase by 30%. But demand for poultry will increase by 120%. Increased demand is not just due to population growth, but due to the emerging middle class in places like China, India, and Southeast Asia. As people become wealthier, they want to consume more meat. According to the World Resource Institute, demand for meat overall is set to nearly double by 2050. Furthermore, led by the livestock sector, today's protein production systems are the single largest anthropogenic use of land and driver of deforestation, using 70% of all agricultural land on the planet. Changing how we produce meat could free up 3 billion hectares of land, a land mass larger than China and India combined, and then doubled. That land could be used for regenerative ranching, renewable energy production, ecosystem restoration, and more. The meat industry is also the #1 user of fresh water resources on the planet, the #1 cause for deforestation, as we said. It causes massive land and water pollution. And finally, in terms of public health, 70% of the world's antibiotics are used in the meat industry. And the UN warned back in 2019 that if no action is taken, drug-resistant diseases could cause 10 million deaths each year by 2050, and damaged the economy akin to the 2008 global financial crisis. So for alternative proteins and conventional meat alike, growing from crop to meat involves some degree of calorie or energy loss. The difference is in the rate of calorie conversion. Animals evolved to move and live and perform all sorts of metabolic functions beyond muscle production. Even after decades of selective breeding and optimization, there are upper limits to how efficiently an animal can turn feed into meat. And the bottom line is extremely wasteful in this regard. For instance, a chicken, the most calorie efficient animal, needs 9 calories of feed to produce 1 calorie of meat. As GFI Executive Director Bruce Friedrich explained at TEDx, that's like cooking 9 plates of pasta and throwing 8 of them away. By growing meat directly from plants or cultivating meat from cells, we can drastically improve this input to output ratio. With alternative proteins, we produce only what we need and don't compete with the other energy requirements of living creatures. So very briefly now about the technology of what is perhaps the highest impact scalable climate solution available outside of energy. Producing meat from plants or animal meat in cultivators, there are 3 primary technologies behind these. So plant-based meat is, in essence, products that are biomimicking meat using plants as the building blocks. They look, taste, and cook like conventional meat. Cultivated meat is identical to animal meat at the cellular level. It provides the same sensory and nutritional profile as conventional meat because it comprises the same cell types and 3D structures as meat from an animal. And lastly, fermentation refers to the use of microorganisms to produce protein directly, or to produce ingredients which enhance our ability to innovate with plant-based or cultivated meat. And that's what we're all about in GFI. We are a nonprofit think tank working to make the global food system better for the planet, people, and animals. With over 180 staff based in strategically selected locations, we work with scientists, policymakers, corporations, and innovators to advance the policy, science, and market for alternative proteins. We deliver all our services free of charge and publish open access science and market research to benefit a range of stakeholders across the industry. Digging into the sustainability data, separate life cycle analysis studies commissioned by Morningstar Farms, Impossible Foods, and Beyond Meat concluded that replacing conventional beef for plant-based beef can reduce land use by 96% and greenhouse gas emissions by 86%. With regard to cultivated meat, according to a rigorous life cycle assessment study GFI commissioned, replacing conventional beef with cultivated beef can reduce land use by 95% and greenhouse gas emissions by 92%. The land saved by making meat from plants and cultivating it from animals can reduce deforestation and free up land for regenerative agriculture and more, as we mentioned. Now, sustainability and food security are great reasons for companies to take a serious look at alternative proteins. But there's another very important reason, and that's the exploding market opportunity. According to a recent BCG report, alternative meat, eggs, seafood, and dairy are expected to be a $290 billion industry by 2035, up from only $4.1 billion in 2020. And the financial services company Jefferies predicts that by 2040, the alternative proteins industry could be as large as $470 billion. But we are not close to being there yet. The global meat industry produces about 350 million metric tons of meat annually, and it is expected to grow to about 500 million metric tons by 2050. Today, alt meat is barely a rounding error in this market, as you can see up here. With government support to facilitate research and development, alternative meats could be indistinguishable from conventional meat in taste and mouthfeel. They could also be cheaper and healthier than products made from animals. That's right, just as combustion engines are now only the second most energy efficient way to move your car, animals can soon be the second or third best way to make meat. You'll be able to drive your car, eat your meat, and still protect the Earth's climate. Also, like clean energy, alternative meats can create hundreds of thousands of high-wage jobs, according to estimates from the Breakthrough Institute. Those could replace unsanitary, unsafe, and low-wage jobs in slaughterhouses. Governments that invest in alternative protein science, innovation, and commercialization will become global leaders in reducing agricultural emissions, improving human health, protecting biodiversity, and increasing food system resilience. And I'm glad to share that governments all around the world are beginning to see the opportunity that alternative proteins will provide and are investing significantly in its R&D and production everywhere across the value chain. And to give just a few examples, the Danish government has announced over 146 million in funding to advance plant-based foods as part of an unprecedented climate agreement for food and agriculture. And this funding is actually the largest investment in plant-based research R&D by any EU country to date. At the end of 2021, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture announced a $10 million investment over 5 years for the flagship National Institute for Cellular Agriculture at Tufts University. And just last week, the Israel Innovation Authority announced it is granting $18 million over 3 years to a cultivated meat consortium of 14 companies and 10 academic labs. The consortium aims to increase the efficiency and cost effectiveness of production methods and pilot opportunities to scale up in an attempt to ensure that Israel leads globally in the rapidly growing industry. One of my favorite quotes is Henry Ford's quote, who said, "If we had asked consumers what they want, they would have said a faster horse." But Ford wasn't constrained by that. Ford introduces the Model T in 1908, and within 10 years, there are more cars than horses on the streets of New York City. I'm absolutely convinced that in the same way that cars have turned horse-drawn carriages into a tourist attraction, we can do the same for meat, so that the idea of growing massive crops and feeding them to animals in order to produce meat would make about as much sense as the idea that I would walk out to the street, hop in a horse-drawn carriage, and say, "Take me from Zagreb to Berlin," instead of driving or flying. So to find out more, just log into our website. It's an absolute Wikipedia of everything alt-protein related. And to all the policymakers in the room, I hope that you will consider looking into the field. At GFI, we're positive that the governments that do so will have bragging rights for the end of time. Thank you.